I'm super happy, excited to introduce Dr. Rutvik Desai as a speaker for our Visiting Scholars series. And so Rutvik is a Carolina Trustees Professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of South Carolina, and also the Director of the Institute of the Mind and Brain down there. And before you were there, you did a lot of work for a while at in Milwaukee University Medical College of Wisconsin. Yes. So Rutvik studies how concept knowledge is represented in the human brain and how we communicate that knowledge through language. And he looks at this in population in healthy adults and also in people with aphasia post-stroke. And he uses lots of methodologies. He's got MRI, computational modeling, lesion symptom mapping, lots of great work. And I've long admired Rutvik's work. We overlap a ton in our interest in concepts and in our research approaches to trying to understand concept knowledge. And so I've always enjoyed reading your work, seeing you at conferences and discussing. And so I'm looking really forward to this talk. So today Rutvik's going to tell us about the anterior temporal lobe, lexical or semantic. So please welcome.
Thanks a lot, Andrew, and thanks for the invitation. I'm excited to be here. You have I'm jealous that you have so many excellent people here. So look forward to talking with you guys more. All right. So I'll be talking about semantic memory or conceptual knowledge. So as you know, this refers to our acquired knowledge about the world. Right. So this includes lots of things, including our knowledge about people, objects, things, relations between various things, actions, cultural norms or cultural knowledge, just facts, and of course it includes word meanings and higher level meanings. And this system we use this system all the time automatically, which is kind of impossible to even imagine not using our semantic memory in some way. So this is a major part of language and communication. Indeed, the entire point of language and communication is to convey meaning. Right? So because of that, it is critical to quality of life. And when this system is affected in many conditions like stroke or dementia, Alzheimer's, even Parkinson's, people have very serious effects on the quality of life. So it is very important to understand the nature of this system, the neural basis of this system, and how can we help people with these kind of deficits. Okay, so the big question is, okay, you can ask, where is semantic memory? So there is a lot of work dedicated to this, including some excellent work by Andrew and colleagues. And this is one of the models of semantic memory, where the idea is that there are some areas in the brain that represents semantic features that are specific to specific modalities, like action or color or vision or sound. And then there are some areas of the brain that maybe they don't care about specific modality so much, but they are thought to integrate or combine inputs from various modalities. So they are indicated in red here. And some of those areas are like angular gyrus, parahippocampal gyrus, posterior cingulate kind of areas come up repeatedly in studies. And anterior temporal lobe is also one of those areas that has been suggested as this kind of integrative area. The word hub is used commonly to describe these areas. So I will be mostly talking about the nature of representations or the functions of the anterior temporal lobe today. Of course, there are other areas that are also very important, but this is one of the major, has been an area of, has been a focus of a lot of work recently, and also it is controversial to some extent. So by anterior temporal lobe, I'm referring to roughly about the 1/3 of the temporal lobe, right? But there are other definitions as well. And there are several views about what it is doing. So the most prominent is the hub and spoke model, which suggests that the ATL is a hub that integrates hub of a system that integrates features that are represented in the brain as well, the sensory features. The dual route model suggests distinguishes between left and right ATL and says that you have maybe the left ATL has to do with lexical concepts and the right ATL has to do with non-verbal visual concepts. It has also important role in emotions, affect, and social processing. Um, there is also a lot of work on what is called unique entities. And so these are things that you identify as something different from not part of a general category, but something specific. And a lot of studies with damage to ATL show that these patients have deficits in especially processing unique entities and memory, and also in combinatorial semantics or syntax is also. So it kind of seems to wear a lot of hats, this area. Uh, and the most common view is probably is about this transmodal hub, where you have these kind of spokes that process modality specific information like sounds or colors or shapes or actions, and then you bring it all together in the anterior temporal lobe, right? So this was the original model proposed in around 2007, and then it has gone through revisions, but the basic nature of this model remains similar. So this is from 2017, which shows kind of a similar idea. There is also a computational model that kind of implements this kind of view. And if you think so, if you accept that, and okay, this is where all then the conceptual knowledge comes together, then we can ask. This is a common task that is used in aphasia work is picture naming. Right, lot of the clinical outcomes are related to picture naming. So we can ask, okay, what exactly is happening when you name a picture? You see a picture and you say the name of the item aloud. What is happening? So you could think about the whole model like this, that you have a picture of a puppy that is processed in your visual cortex. You have low level visual processing, then high level visual processing that will activate concepts that are located in the anterior temporal lobe, entire concept size. So this is still at the conceptual level, and that will activate lemmas. Some people think of lemmas being in the posterior temporal lobe here. So the concept will activate the lemma, which will activate the phonological code somewhere around posterior STG and SMG, which will then you go to the inferior frontal regions involving phonetic encoding, syllabification, and then you actually produce the output, right? And the inferior frontal gyrus is helps you control the correct concept and correct lemma when there is always competition between concepts, similar concepts. So IFG is going to help you navigate that, right? So this is kind of a model that is probably be accepted by many. Um, so I will describe a bunch of studies that characterize functions of ATL using different kind of stimuli and different kind of tasks to kind of try to nail down, okay, is this really true or is it hub or what is it doing, right? So I'll talk about one study that is relates to lesion deficit mapping in stroke survivors, then a couple of HD studies, brain stimulation studies that stimulate the ATL to see the effects on various kind of tasks, and then finally one fMRI study. Okay, so let's see. Let's start with the lesion symptom mapping study. So here we had 79 stroke survivors, and we tested them on four tasks: lexical decision, object naming, we have auditory word comprehension, and then pyramids and pantries. So the first three tasks are lexical, involve processing words, and this pyramids and pantries is designed to be non-lexical. It's the picture version of it. So it assesses conceptual knowledge, but in a non-lexical way. And if you think about semantic demand of these tasks can be thought to have high semantic demand in the sense that you need to sort of understand the concept in some fashion. Lexical decision has a low semantic demand in the sense that technically you don't need to understand the meaning of the word, you just need to decide if it is a real word or not. Nonetheless, some amount of meaning is always activated by lexical decision, but you would say the task demands, semantic demands are low. Okay. Uh, and this is the well-known the pyramids and pantries task where you have to associate, you have to say this is more associated with this or that. And so this is our non-verbal semantic test. Uh, and here we did voxel-based lesion symptom mapping in two regions of interest. So the anterior temporal lobe and then a posterior, the inferior parietal lobe. Uh, so we did voxel-based, and then we also did connectivity-based lesion symptom mapping, looking at white matter connectivity strength. Right, and the general strategy is that we factor out performance in one task to look at the what is the residual contribution of the other task, right? So we can compare object naming versus PPT and so forth. This is the lesion coverage. You have fairly good coverage. This is the typical MCA, middle cerebral artery stroke patients, and lot of perisylvian coverage, but we also have coverage in the lateral ATL, right? Um, and the prediction from the hub and spokes type of model would be that unilateral damage to ATL should impair performance on semantic tasks, regardless of whether they are verbal or non-verbal. And tasks that are not semantically demanding should be associated less with ATL damage than semantic demanding ones. So something like lexical decision, which is not very semantic, perhaps that will be associated less with the ATL. Right. So this is what we find when we compare lexical decision versus PPT. Right. So the red area shows uh, worse performance for lexical decision after regressing out the performance on pyramids and boundaries. So accounting for the variance in pyramids and boundaries, what is left for lexical decision, that is red. The blue is the reverse, where after regressing out lexical decision, what is left for pyramids and boundaries. And we see that in the ATL, we have predicts performance in lexical decision versus more the angular gyrus post inferior parietal regions predicts performance in PPT. Okay. If we compare object naming versus PPT, we see again uh, damage in the ATL is associated with worse performance in object naming. And there are no areas actually that come up. There's nothing blue here, so no blue areas, no areas associated with worse performance in PPT after factoring out object naming. And so this is the voxel-wise analysis, and this is the connectivity analysis, where these connections are especially crucial for object naming. Connections between ventral ATL and the posterior temporal lobe and the inferior parietal. Auditory word comprehension versus PPT, we find a similar finding that we have this kind of ATL areas predicting worse performance in auditory word comprehension, and there are no blue areas again, right? And these are several interhemispheric connections as well as within left hemisphere connections predict worse auditory word comprehension performance after factoring out the non-verbal semantic task. Okay, so in summary, damage to left atrial is associated with all tasks that require that have a verbal component, even the one with low semantic demands, which is lexical decision. And left atrial damage was not associated with PPT performance, which is not consistent with the hub and spoke model, right? So angular gyrus damage was associated with worse with worse PPT. Okay. So now let's look at a few studies with brain stimulation. One of the issues with the pyramids and pantries task, although it is kind of very common clinical task, the issue it is that it also has a lot of executive demands. So it assesses semantics, but in addition, you also need a lot of executive performance. So the performance in this task can be bad because you have executive deficits, or because you have semantic deficits, or any combination of that. And so it's not an ideal task. If we have, in fact, one paper under review right now that kind of argues that this is not a good task to use because it's mostly showing you executive deficits. But so to get around that, we developed a new task to assess nonverbal semantics, and we compared that with lots of different tasks that have kind of a lexical component, right? So we have lexical decision, word picture matching, word naming, lexical semantic judgment, and then finally the picture plausibility task. And we have two studies, kind of parallel studies, where we apply stimulation to the ATL or apply sham stimulation within subjects. And in a parallel experiment, we stimulate the temporo-occipital cortex. Mm. So this is like a control area to compare results with ATL with some other areas that are also thought to be involved in semantic. Right. So first, let me describe this experiment with these two tasks. Okay, so this is the picture plausibility task where we have objects and actions, but they can be plausible, real things, or some kind of implausible actions, right? So you have to make a semantic judgment that, yeah, this kind of makes sense, this is normal, this is kind of very unlikely thing to happen. So it is not very plausible, right? So the idea behind development of this task was that we wanted to have a single stimulus that you just judge instead of having multiple alternatives that you have to compare and juggle, which creates a lot of executive demands and short-term memory demands. So instead of that, if you have a single item, there's always some amount of executive function that's required for anything, but this is relatively, at least you don't have juggling alternatives. You just process whether, hey, this makes sense or doesn't make sense. Right? And we compare that with lexical semantic judgment task, where we have some words and they just have to judge whether it's a concrete thing or an abstract thing. And this is the stimulation. So in the first experiment, we have the kind of anterior temporal lobe stimulated, mostly the strongest in the lateral ATL. And in the second experiment, we have the TOC, where we have more the posterior temporal lobe, occipitotemporal cortex is stimulated. And then this is 1 milliampere annual stimulation, right, of 20 minutes. These are kind of standard parameters. Uh, and what we find, so with the ATL stimulation, we find that the semantic judgment, it affects semantic judgment RT significantly, uh, but the picture plausibility task is not affected, right? And so this is kind of showing similar to the previous study that, okay, the verbal task is being affected with ATO stimulation, the non-verbal semantic task is not affected. But because this is a negative result, you might say that maybe the task is bad, it doesn't have enough sensitivity, or there is some problem with it. So, so we use this kind of control site to see whether it is just an issue of task or power or something like that. And the TOC, we get both. We get semantic judgment is significant, but the picture plausibility is also highly significant. Right. So these three conditions here we have significance. Only thing that is not has no effect is the non-verbal semantic task with anterior temporal stimulation. Oops, sorry. Oh. Okay, so ATL stimulation affects the verbal semantic task, but not the non-verbal task, and the TOC stimulation affects both. That's the finding. Okay, so in the next study we have two tasks. One is word picture matching and lexical decision. So here we are not comparing verbal versus non-verbal, but we are comparing different modalities. So we have both tasks in both modalities. It's like a 2x2 design where you have word picture matching visually or auditorily, lexical decision also in both modalities. And both tasks should be affected by ATL stimulation in both modalities. Because ATS stimulation should affect the underlying amodal semantic representations. So your semantic, the meaning of the word itself is affected, and whether you process the word auditorily or whether you process the word visually shouldn't really matter, right? So both stars should be affected similarly, according to the hub and spoke style model. Right? So what do we find? We find that with lexical, both tasks are affected. So with lexical decision, this is auditory, this is visual, and this is the yellow is the real stimulation, and this is the cyan color is the sham stimulation. And we have speeding up of reaction times with real stimulation in the auditory auditory lexical decision, but slowing of responses in the visual lexical decision, right? With the same stimulation in the same subjects. And we go to word picture matching we find similar. But in the auditory word picture matching task, we have speeding of responses. Visually, we have slowing down. So indeed, both tasks are affected with ATL stimulation, but in the opposite directions in the two modalities. Right? Um, so this is not consistent with the idea that ATL is the source of some kind of amodal semantic representations, right? Uh, uh, because the modality should be irrelevant. So you can ask like, why is there? What is the? How is it possible that there are opposite effects? And we can think of different hypotheses, but one of the hypotheses we have is that the HTTDCS effects can reverse based on whether the neuronal populations are parallel to the field or perpendicular to the field. Right. And if ATL has a role in mapping between form and meaning, right? So not storing the meaning itself, but mapping between form and meaning. Then units doing the mapping between auditory and visual forms and differ can be in different locations. For example, auditory mapping can happen in the STG, dorsal ATL, and the visual units directly connections coming from the visual word from area in the anterior fusiform gyrus, they can be underneath, and so they can be perpendicular to the field of stimulation, and that's why we get different effects. This is one hypothesis. Um, okay. In the next study, we look at word naming. This would be of interest to people who are interested in reading. So here the task is to just read words aloud. And the theoretically interesting part of this is that often patients who have semantic dementia or what we call semantic variant of primary progressive aphasia, they also tend to have surface alexia. So surface alexia is trouble reading low frequency words that have inconsistent spelling to sound mapping. Right. So words, these are like words that non-native speakers especially find hard because like sort of they are illogical in some way. So words like yacht or pint that are not pronounced like other words, right? So these are low frequency inconsistent words are problematic. And atrophy in these patients includes the ATL, right? So you might say, okay, this makes sense because you have damage to ATL that causes semantic deficits, right? And that causes trouble in inconsistent word reading because to read inconsistent words, you need support from semantics to read according to some models of reading. This is not like universally accepted, but some models of reading, like the triangle model, suggest that if a word is regular, spelling to sound mapping is regular, you can map phonology or orthography to phonology. You don't need anything else. But if the word is inconsistent, then you have to go through a semantic route. Go to from orthography, you say what it means, and that gives you the pronunciation, right? So it kind of makes sense. But the problem is that in some cases these disorders dissociate. So there are reports of patients who have semantic deficits but don't have surface alexia, and there are patients who have surface alexia but don't have semantic deficits, right? So this has created some kind of controversy. This would have been kind of nice, neat explanation of why these two things are kind of go together generally, but having cases like this kind of throws a monkey wrench into the issue. Uh, so we want to see if we stimulate the ATL like this before, what is the effect on reading consistent words, inconsistent words, and does that correlate with nonverbal semantic tasks, right? So we have kind of 2x2 design. We have consistent words, inconsistent words, and each one are in high frequency and low frequency kind of groups. And what we find is that these are high frequency words, these are low frequency words. This is the first two bars are consistent words, these are inconsistent terms. Right? So in the case of low frequency word, we get a interaction consistency into stimulation interaction. So both types of words are affected differently by stimulation. So inconsistent words are kind of affected the most, and in the opposite direction as the consistent words. High frequency words are not affected so much, right? So there is a stimulation into consistency interaction for low frequency words. and it is kind of similar to surface alexia, where low frequency inconsistent words are problematic. Right? So we can sort of replicate that, but does that correlate with performance in a non-verbal semantic task? Right. So the and general explanation that yes, with damage to ATL or stimulation to ATL, you are affecting semantics. That is leading to issues with inconsistent words. But here we have the non-verbal, the picture plausibility task. With ATL stimulation, there is no effect, but with the temporo-occipital cortex, we have significant effects. So the task in this subjects also, the picture plausibility task, there was no effect, but they had effects in the consistency effects. Right. So ATL stimulation leads to surface alexia-like effects, uh, but this is not accompanied by non-verbal semantic effects. Right. So it suggests that ATL does have a role in reading inconsistent words, like there are many reports, but this role is not tied to semantics. Right. It is something else. All right. So to summarize the study so far, um, damage to lateral ventral ATL or its stimulation affects tasks that have a verbal component. Um, and highly semantic but non-verbal tasks are not affected by lesions or stimulation of ATL, at least the lateral ATL. And so ATL is unlikely to be a semantic hub that integrates features into coherent concepts as is suggested. So it seems to play a lexical role, but not a semantic role. Right. All right. So I'm suggesting that this role can be related to mapping between word forms and semantics, and not in storing semantics themselves. Right. So we might modify the model that I showed you earlier at what happens in picture naming, right? So I would suggest that where you processor see a picture like this, that activates concepts that are distributed in a lot of areas, but including this lateral occipitotemporal cortex involved in visual semantics, posterior fusiform gyrus. All of this is involved in high level concept processing, non-verbal concept processing. And those concepts are going to activate the lemmas that are located in the ATL, right? So we are flipping where the concepts are and where the lemmas are in this model. And that those lemmas are then going to be connected to the phonological code, which will lead you to eventually produce the correct output, right? So this kind of a model is is something that can be tested. And when you read, that is what was picture naming. When you read, you process the word for around your visual word form area in the fusiform gyrus, and that can lead to activation of the lemma like units or the mapping units in the ATL. That can then you go to the phonological code, and then you go to the inferior frontal mediums. Mm. So again, this kind of model is testable with looking at the tiny codes of activation of various parts of the system. Okay. And in terms of classic models of word production, this is the Lovett's classic model, where you have concept preparation, lexical selection, and then you have lemma leading to phonological retrieval. It's kind of it is a single unidirectional model, and a competing model is Dell's interactive two-step model, where you have bidirectional connections. You have semantic features, that you have these units called word units, and then you have phonological representations. But both of these models have this one layer. This model, they are called lemmas. Here they are called word units. But the role of these things is to map phonology or orthography to semantics. Right. So these are in this model, these units are not something that kind of integrates concepts. These are units that simply are activated by presence of the correct features in this in the semantic layers. Right. So these are kind of localist units that they don't represent the entire concept itself. They represent the particular item, a particular mapping between this and this. Right. So I am suggesting that ATL, instead of storing the semantic information, so being here ETL is actually here. So this is what ETL is doing, is mapping between orthography and semantics, or phonology and semantics, not storing semantics. Right. So at this point, maybe some of you are going, our invited speaker has completely lost his mind. And who invited this guy? Because it's all like totally well known that this is a semantic hub, and there is so much evidence, and there is like 50 papers at least that show that ATL is a semantic hub. So what's going on, right? So yeah, so if you feel like John McEnroe, I go, maybe. So I will just briefly kind of touch on some of the evidence. We probably won't have time to discuss every detail, but I want to just mention some of the important evidence that suggests that ETL is a hub, and then I will sort of argue against it, that what's the problem with that. Right? So people who think that ETL is a hub are not crazy. There is a good reason to think that. There are reasons to believe so. It's quite a reasonable hypothesis, given, especially given this, how the whole thing started is from patients with semantic dementia, or the semantic variant of PPA, right? And they found that they have atrophy in ATL, and they have both verbal and non-verbal deficits. So it would sort of make sense, right? So what about that? Like, how can you explain that? So one thing to keep in mind is that these patients have atrophy in ATL, but they have significant atrophy outside ATL as well. So it's never restricted to one area of the brain, right? That's one thing. And second side of the dissociation is that some individuals don't have non-verbal deficits, right? So people who have atrophy in ATL and outside also don't have non-verbal deficits, but they always have verbal non-lexical deficits. So here are some examples. Atrophy in the semantic variant of primary progressive aphasia is widespread, not restricted to ATL. So this is one study from Wilson and colleagues, where they show this is the patient. This is a map of patient with the semantic dementia, the semantic variant. This is the logopenic variant, right? So here you can see, okay, atrophy in ATL, but it extends almost throughout the whole temporal lobe. And moreover, in this kind of studies, these maps have thresholded at E less than 0.00001, right? So it's thresholded at very strict level, and still it is quite widespread. So if you threshold it, let's say at 0.001, something more reasonable, this would even be, the actual atrophy is even wider than this. This is, they are trying to reduce the area because so it doesn't look like everything is atrophied, right? So that's one thing. And second thing to note is that it is generally claimed that ATL atrophy and semantic dementia, there is kind of one-to-one correspondence. And other variants of PPA have damage, atrophy elsewhere, right? That also happens to be not the case. You can see here, this is the logopenic variant. That includes also ATL atrophy, right? So this is the whole one-to-one correspondence is questionable. This is another study by Mesuram and colleagues. And also, these are all semantic patients, but you can see that the atrophy is quite spreads well into the middle and the posterior temporal lobe. So when these patients have deficits, verbal and non-verbal deficit, where are they coming from? Which part of this whole area is responsible for producing those deficits is not clear. They will often talk about the area of peak atrophy, right, the brightest spot, but this peak atrophy, but there is a lot of atrophy elsewhere also. Right? And this is a map of patients, all the patients in their cohort that have non-semantic PPA, right? Everything another, and they also have entire temporal lobe, including the ATLB is atrophied, and they are, none of them are semantic PPA. Right? So this initial suggestions that okay, there is kind of one-to-one correspondence between semantic dementia and ATL atrophy does not seem to be holding up very well. Okay, then the deficits in these patients. Okay, so several studies show that in PPA, in stroke, or in ATL resection for epilepsy, deficits in patients are lexical but not semantic. Okay, so I showed a couple of studies, but there are several other studies. I will briefly mention a few here. This study by Hurley et al. They examine patients with mild atrophy in the ATL or severe atrophy in the ATL. And both groups of patients had impairments in lexical tasks, but could do non-verbal tasks like picture association tasks. Right. They also measured N400 with EEG in these patients, and they found N400 abnormalities for lexical tasks like picture word matching, but not in non-verbal tasks like picture association. In the Mesulam 2013 study, again, the ATL atrophy patients exhibited pure retrieval failures without a non-verbal, semantic, or associative component. Okay, so several different tasks involving naming or word picture matching and so on, uh, deficits, but purely picture task, no deficits. Uh, Study by Lambon Ralph themselves looked at 20 epilepsy patients which had unilateral ATL resection, and they tested them on 6 tasks. 5 were verbal tasks, 1 was non-verbal tasks. And they found that 19 out of 20 patients had no deficit in the non-verbal task, but all had, which was action object matching, just using pictures, but had all of them had deficits in verbal tasks, right? So these are some examples that kind of the general image that, okay, this is once you get some kind of ATL atrophy or damage, you will always have amodal deficits across the board. That also does not seem to be putting up very well. Okay. Now, fMRI studies. Many fMRI studies do not show activation for non-verbal sematics in the ATM unless there is some caveats to that. So unless we're talking about unique entities or you're talking about some short-term memory loads, something like that. In general concepts, most studies don't show any activation. And the common reason given for this, which is a reasonable reason, is that you have signal loss in ATL. In fMRI is not very good at imaging ATL. Uh, uh, so maybe that's why you are not you are getting sort of negative results, although it is a central hub. Uh, so I mean, it's kind of true that in the ventral medial surface of ATL, there is signal loss if you use default scanning parameters, but you can optimize parameters in such a way that the signal loss is minimized. And even in studies with scanning parameters that are optimized to detect ATL signal, failed to show activation in nonverbal tasks. But they do show activation to any lexical stimuli. So it is, you can't really say that, okay, you are not getting any activation there for any task, so it doesn't count. You do get activation, just not for your non-verbal tasks. Okay, so here are some examples of some studies. This is one of our studies which had lexical distant tasks where we are comparing words and pseudo words, or a picture plausibility kind of task. We are comparing pictures compared to scrambled pictures. Okay, and with the lexical task, we get activation in the ATL. With the pictures, we get strong activation in the occipito-temporal cortex, but nothing in the ATL. Okay, so this kind of shows that, okay, you do have ability to detect signal in the ATL, but it's just not, you don't have any signal. This is a study by Fernandino and colleagues. They took large number of words that varied in various semantic dimensions, like whether they had color was salient, motion was salient, sound was salient, different modalities, action, and so on. They looked at modality specific areas, which semantic feature modulated which areas, and then they found some areas that were modulated by any feature. As long as you had more of anything, it was activated. So these were like semantic, they identified semantic hubs. And they found angular gyrus, posterior cingulate, retrospinian cortex, parahippocampal gyrus, medial prefrontal cortex. But notably absent in this is the ATL. Right? So there are hub regions that people have found, but that happens that does not include ATL. And this is another study. This is by Fairhall and Karamazza. They have 5 categories of concepts like animals, tools, fruits, and so forth. And they did classification and representation similarity analysis. They did the conditions were using words or using pictures, right? And then they saw which areas can classify training on words, doing on picture, or vice versa, right? So the cross-modal classifications of concept categories, they also found these kind of usual suspect areas: angular gyrus, posterior cingulate, occipitotemporal cortex, um, ventral temporal cortex, parahippocampal areas. All these areas were able to classify the concepts in categories across modalities, but ATL was not. They even did an RO analysis of ATL specifically to increase power there, but there is not. So the fMRI evidence is also not very clear with respect to ATL. Um, Another thing to keep in mind is that a lot of the results that you see often conflate different grain areas under the same label. So sometimes the study will say that something was happening in ATL over here, but that happens to be like anterior STG. And another study would say something was happening here, which is totally different things. And but both of them would use the term ATL. So this creates an image that, well, with ATL, all kinds of things are activating it, or it is causing all kinds of deficits. But actually, we are talking about totally different areas. And especially with respect to non-verbal semantics, this kind of area, mid-fusiform gyrus, is indeed involved in high-level visual semantics. So if you had damage here, or if you do an ECOG study recording in electrodes from here, you will get definitely non-verbal signals. But this is different from the other areas that people commonly talk about as ATL, right? So this kind of creates some confusion. Okay, so now switching gears slightly, this is fine. So hopefully I provided some arguments about that this whole idea should be taken with caution. Um, what about unique entities? So there was a significant body of literature that shows that ATL is especially important for unique entities. These are typically things like famous people, famous faces, or famous places that you know about. And when you have damage to ATL, patients have specific deficits in identifying, naming, or recognizing these unique entities. And neuroimaging studies also show that ATL is crucial for or is activated by unique entities, either for naming or for recognition. Right? And this is consistent with the hub account in the sense that all these the unique entities we have semantic knowledge about it, right? If you see the picture of Tom Cruise, then that brings to mind a lot of information you have about Tom Cruise, what kind of movies he does, how much you like him, and so forth, right? So if you have a semantic region, a semantic hub, that's going to be activated by that kind of concept strongly, and that can lead to activation in ATL. So you be with unique entities, the issue is that we always have a lot of semantic knowledge about them. So we can't really say whether it is ATL itself is the semantic knowledge that is activating a given area, or is it the fact that simply that is a unique entity and you're identifying it as such, right? Um, so we did a training study to address this. Right, several studies already exist that train participants to associate novel entities with some semantic features. So you give them a novel person, and you say, okay, this person is an engineer who likes to play baseball and lives here, and so forth. And they memorize these kind of semantic features. And then when you compare trained items with semantic features with untrained items, you get activation in ETL, right? So this is fine, but it's unclear whether the response is related to the learned semantic knowledge or to the entity itself, right? So in order to minimize this issue, we train participants to recognize many types of entities, but no semantic features are given. You simply are asked that this is something that you remember, that's it, but nothing else. There is no other additional semantic features are given. And we examined a number of different categories. So people, buildings, objects, numbers, non-words, and then real words. So this kind of training, we can say we kind of uniquify these items. So normally they are general, but because they are specifically you are being trained on them, for you they become unique entities, right? It's sort of like you for a car is a general entity for you, but your own car is a unique entity for you, right? Because like it's your car versus some car going on a road somewhere is just some car. It's like a member of a larger category. So we kind of create that with training. So we have pictures of people, pictures of various buildings. We have objects, then we have numbers, non-words, and real words, right? And participants are trained in multiple sessions to recognize these items uh, amongst foils. And the foils are always different over multiple days. And then they are scanned 24 to 48 hours after the final training session in a familiarity judgment task. And scanning is optimized to minimize signal loss in ATL, right? And the familiar and unfamiliar stimuli are counterbalanced across participants. So when we compare familiar to unfamiliar stimuli across subjects, it is exactly the same items, right? This shows a map of coverage in the ATL where we have fairly good coverage. Okay, so these are the results. So these are like classifying between familiar and unfamiliar items for each of the categories. And the summary is that for this kind of task, this is a very common task in memory research, and we would always expect activation in hippocampus and surrounding areas for these kind of things, right? Like items that we recognize. We were especially interested in the lateral ATL and ventral ATL, whether that is going to show anything. Hippocampus, you would expect. And for people, we get activation in the ATL here. You can see in the lateral and ventral ATL, right? So it is not just hippocampus. For buildings, similarly, we get lateral ATL, ventral ATL. For objects, also very success. These are all cluster connected with permutation testing. And after that, these areas survive. With even with numbers, we get activations in the lateral ATL and ventromedial ATL with just the fact that you recognize a number as being familiar, right? We have non-words. Non-words also have activation there. And then the words, when we compare words, familiar versus unfamiliar words, we also get that. So any entity, when recognized as a unique or a familiar item, activates used to activate the ATL, and this includes non-verbal items, right? So they're just pictures. And this includes classical kind of non-semantic items. So if you do any semantic study as a control, you always use non-words or numbers or something like that, because this is the most like non-semantic thing. But even those things, if you identify it as a unique entity, then it seems to activate ATF. Right. So I conclude with this kind of overview that like what can be kind of what is the story. And I would suggest that ATL can be understood as supporting unique or arbitrary mappings in both in a short-term context and a long-term context, right? So whenever you need to map to arbitrary things, ATL does the job of mapping. And so entities that should not be confused with other items because they have similar features. Right? And this could be supported by sparse or localist representations as opposed to dense distributed representations. Right? So localist representations have the characteristics that very similar items can have very distinct representations, and therefore it helps you to not confuse the items, which is very crucial. So why would it be important for lexical processing? Because words are unique entities. So normally we don't think of words as unique entities in that way, but they represent a largely arbitrary mapping between some kind of form and some kind of meaning. And an important characteristic of words is that if two words have a lot of overlap, half of the letters are similar or most of the letters are similar, that doesn't tell you anything because the word can have a completely different meaning, right? So you don't want to go by feature overlap. Two similar sounding words or similarly written words can have completely different meaning. And so it is this kind of mappings for which ATL is important. So that's why ATL has a role in representing representing words. So I will stop here and thank the funders and my lab members who did most of the work. So thank you so much.